The Loudness War. We all endured it, some of us fought in it, and most of us survived to tell the tale. While I feel that we've come back around as an industry to a somewhat reasonable compromise since the worst days of it, it certainly left an indelible mark on the music of the era. As this was an industry-wide trend, we couldn't possibly talk about all of the bastardized releases of the era, but there are a few infamous examples we must mention. 1999's Californication by the Red Hot Chili Peppers was one of the first widely popular examples of audible clipping and digital distortion on a CD release, something usually prevented in the past, but now seemingly aimed for. Produced by Rick Rubin and mastered by Vlado Meller, who would earn the nickname Vlad the Impaler during this period, these two names are common in discussions of the Loudness War, both in tandem and separately. I remember Metallica bragging on their website blog that 2003's Saint Anger would be the loudest CD ever while attending their mastering sessions with Meller. Little did anyone know they'd earn that title in earnest a few years later. Sometimes it can be difficult to pinpoint exactly where the audible clipping is occurring, as extreme abuse in the mixing stage was also becoming commonplace, as we mentioned. But peaks above 0 dB full scale on a final mix can be minimized in mastering and prevented from reaching the final master in pressing. According to the Dynamic Range database linked below, the US CD release of Californication exceeds 0 dBFS, point of digital clipping, on several tracks. That tells me it was likely a mastering choice, especially since certain vinyl releases of the album don't have audible distortion apparent on engineer Jim Scott's mix or on the vinyl mastering. Hard clipping has been used on more aggressive hip-hop, industrial, and extreme metal recordings in the past, but that was always more of a creative choice in the tracking or mixing stage, and not a glaring blight on a relatively softer rock song like Scar Tissue. Speaking of Rick Rubin, he developed a workflow on his productions similar to the multiple vinyl transfers of the 50s and 60s, but with mixing as well as mastering involved. Not sure when it began, but in the early 2000s, it was common for Rick to have several mix engineers have a go at a particular project, then after choosing his favorite mixer, would do the same with mastering. As Rick was producing some of the biggest modern rock albums of the era, this became a bit of a competition, and some mixers started getting wins by pushing their mixes into the kind of compression and clipping territory that they knew Rick favored from his mastering tastes. I give Rick credit that he's always insisted he doesn't care how something is done, just whether the result moves him emotionally or not, and based on his decades of success, it's tough to dispute that. I do know of at least one mixer, Rich Costi, who has admitted he grew tired of this constant competition and pulled himself out of the pool after dissatisfaction with how one of his album mixes was handled. Not positive which album this was, but have a good guess based on the era and personnel. Two other infamous Rubin productions deserve mention. The first, 2005's Volume 3, The Subliminal Verses by Slipknot, mixed by Greg Fiddleman and mastered by Ted Jensen, has audible distortion from clipping and greatly reduced dynamic range from compression and brickwalling, only about a 3 dB dynamic range total. Even when compared to their other loud, aggressive releases, this is extreme, but the CD does not have any peaks over 0 dBFS, thankfully. The next example could be its own discussion entirely, and that's 2008's Death Magnetic by Metallica. With a dynamic range of only 2 to 3 dB and every song peaking over 0 dB full scale on the original CD release, audible distortion throughout, and the greatest case of ear fatigue that I've ever experienced, Death Magnetic won the Loudness War, as mixer Andrew Sheps has proudly stated. In fairness, Greg Fiddleman mixed some of it too. Mastering engineer Ted Jensen even responded to fan criticism via email, stating that the mixes were brickwalled when he received them, and he was not proud to be associated with the project. Clearly not as proud as Sheps was. What made this release so infamous was that, coinciding with the album release, the tracks became available for the popular video game Guitar Hero via stem submixes submitted to the gaming company before the aforementioned brickwalling and clipping, giving fans a clear-cut before and after comparison, with many preferring the sound of the video game tracks. Something like 20,000 fans signed an online petition to have the album remixed and remastered, but to no avail, as the band denied there was anything technically wrong with the release at the time. It's also worthy to note that the same year as Death Magnetic, Guns N' Roses released the long-awaited Chinese Democracy and went in the opposite direction for an incredibly dynamic master by the great Bob Ludwig. Bob presented Axl Rose and producer Karim Costanzo with 3 versions of his master, loud, moderate, and dynamic, and to his surprise and delight, they chose the most dynamic option. For all the criticism of Axl and the nearly 10 years of work that went into that album, he deserves a lot of credit for this choice. Thankfully, not everyone in the industry had lost their minds. While Death Magnetic and Guitar Hero may have made the extremes obvious to many casual listeners, didn't stop the perpetuation of it. Rubin struck again with Black Sabbath's 13 in 2013, mixed again by Andrew Sheps, but mastered by Stephen Markison. Every track peaks over 0 dB FS, and the clipping distortion is obvious, but at least the overall dynamic range is a more modest 5 to 6 dB compared to Def Magnetic's 2 to 3. I'm certainly not trying to criticize any mixing or mastering engineers who were just trying to make a living during this time period, doing what the industry had deemed necessary and began creeping towards inch by inch or dB by dB since the 1950s. Not everyone has the ability or clout to challenge direction from a producer, artist, or label in such a competitive field without the risk of losing work. And this wasn't just happening with heavy rock and metal music either. Hip-hop, contemporary rock, R&B, pop, country, and all sorts of other artists and genres were guilty, as well as multitudes of remastered legacy albums. Ricky Martin's 1999 hit single Livin' La Vida Loca was one well-known example, as well as the Black Eyed Peas' Elefunk, featuring the big hit Let's Get It Started in 2004. And in terms of dynamics, the 1997 CD reissue of Iggy and the Stooges' Raw Power infamously features a 1 dB dynamic range with the closest RMS levels to 0 dB full scale without overs that I could find for an artist of that level. It should be a cautionary example of brick wall limiter abuse. Some consider this the loudest CD ever mastered, but I find Def Magnetic physically hurts a bit more. What did help eventually was the growing popularity of iTunes, Apple Music, and music streaming in general. With iTunes single sales peaking and surpassing CDs by 2012, a listener shuffling through their Metallica collection on their iPod or phone would be blasted directly in the earbuds by a Def Magnetic tune coming on after the original master of, say, Master Puppets or Ride the Lightning. Even with Apple Soundcheck enabled, which normalized to an RMS standard until recently, the jump in volume was obvious and startling to many. And when compared to the more recently remastered versions of their back catalog, closer in level to the newer releases, the audible clipping and distortion of Def Magnetic was even more apparent at equal volume. Finally, after years of denying there was anything wrong with the initial release, the band finally issued a remastered for iTunes version of Def Magnetic in 2015, devoid of clipping and extraneous distortion, much more pleasing to the ear. I've heard more than one fan state the album went from a least favorite to a top 3 after that remaster, and I felt this capitulation by one of the biggest bands in the world was a great sign for the industry as a whole. Although we're still louder and less dynamic than the golden age of CD mastering, it's an acceptable compromise from the worst of it for many of us. Now, most media streaming services are normalizing playback to integrated LUFS, or loudness units full scale, a measurement more in line with how the human ear perceives loudness, with an emphasis on the frequency spectrum instead of just overall RMS average. For example, a bass-heavy song may lead to a high RMS level, but the perceived loudness may be lower compared to a track with the 3 to 4 kilohertz upper mid-range area emphasized, and any odd harmonic distortion generated from hard clipping appearing in that upper mid-range treble area as well. This is the range that causes ear fatigue. It's not perfect, but it's getting closer, and with the most popular streaming providers like Spotify and Apple Music playing back at or near the same perceived loudness levels, there's no longer any real incentive for mastering or mixing engineers to push their work to these extreme limits anymore. Personally, I've been using Tidal Hi-Fi for music streaming over the last few years and have none of the level jumping complaints that were an issue in years past on iTunes and other services. Just as many forms of traditional sound engineering have been devalued in the modern industry, mastering might be the most heavily affected, with adaptive plugins and AI algorithms available now for a fraction of what a quality mastering session would cost, and still a bit of a negative connotation lingering over the profession from the Loudness War hangover. It's really too bad because with so much home recording and mixing happening in less than ideal environments, quality mastering really should be more important than ever. The one aspect of mastering that I valued the most as a mixer was the additional perspective of an experienced set of ears in an ideal acoustically treated environment, certainly more ideal than my home studio. It wasn't just about the compression or EQ, but the feedback I got that helped me make my next mix even better. When I was at my busiest, I worked with Brad Blackwood of Euphonic Masters as much as possible. Our first project together was actually when he was still at Ardent Studios in Memphis. It became invaluable to get his perspective and hear the results of my mixes after sending them to him. Brad never defaulted to louder is better mode like so many others, and I appreciated that tremendously. There were a few times when a client insisted on going with someone else for a louder master, as this was the mid-2000s and loud was in, but I always did my best to try and convince them otherwise, even demonstrating how a crushed master can result in ear fatigue at louder listening levels. Like all battles, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but Brad's work speaks for itself over the past 20-plus years. So, to summarize all of this, the louder is better mantra is as old as recorded music, from jukeboxes to radio stations to CD remasters. But when combined with new technology, it pushed things beyond reasonable limits and led to a gradual game of one-upmanship that lasted until the public at large decided it had enough. It's always too bad when the worst offenders create an awareness of something that could have been prevented in the first place, but in the end, I suppose that's just human nature. If you have any personal experience with album mastering or just as a casual listener, please let me know. I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. I'll be back soon with a 3-part series on the evolution of modern production techniques and how we got here as an industry.